Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is December the 20th, 2021, and this, of course, is a meeting of the West Shore Photography Club. Hey, I have good news for you. Tomorrow is December the 21st, which is also winter solstice. The days will start getting longer.
Yes. Yay.
They'll also be colder for a while, but they'll be getting longer, which is encouraging. Okay, wanted to let you know or remind you that we have a little break coming up for the holiday. There will be no meeting the next 2 Monday nights. So we have December the 27th and January the 3rd. No meetings. Our next meeting will be on Monday, January I guess that's the 10th, isn't it? Yes, January the 10th, which will be an image review. There is a theme. So if you want to prepare for that image review on January the 10th, it's night photography. And Lori Snyder will be reviewing the images that night. Okay. Joe, how about talking about trips?
There were no trips this past weekend. Coming up will be one on Saturday, January the 8th, and we're going to be at the Bay Shore Farm. That's over in Hampton Township, the only last working farm in Hampton Township, and it's part of the West Shore Historical Society and the West Shore Photography Club joint venture. It'll be at 10 o'clock, and we're going to be photographing a house, and there's also a really nice barn on the premise, and he's cleaning that out, and we can be photographing that. That's on January the 8th, 10 o'clock. Then on the 15th, which is a Saturday, the following Saturday, we're going to be going to the Bittner House, and you'll get more information about that. It truly is an old historic house, and it's beautiful to photograph on the outside. And then just a little preview of some other things coming up on February the 5th, we're going to be going to Strasburg Railroad. Now, for those of you who have not been there, it is an indoor venue, but it is really cool to get shots. It's great. And that'll be on the Saturday, February the 9th. And then on the February the 6th, the 5th is the railroad. And then on the 6th, we're going to the gallery at Lebanon Valley College. And Lewis Hines, a photographer, will have a show there. And Mike Donovan's going to be there to tell us all about that. And that'll be at noontime on a Sunday, lasts about an hour. And then we have some trips coming up to Middle Creek for the geese migration in mid-February. We're going to have 2 trips, one during the week and then one on the Saturday. And just for information, we're not having a club trip to it, but Conowingo Dam is still in operation, so to speak, with eagles, and that's a good place to go. I suggest you go during the week and not on weekends. And just one little notice I want to mention to you, that on Sunday, February the 6th, will be the deadline for you to take any of the images you've taken of any of the historic properties and get them into Dennis in a digital form so he can prepare a book for the show that we're going to have. Now, there's a lot more to it than what I just said, okay? And we're going to be sending out, maybe Dennis, you can do that with tomorrow's note about that listing of the sites. So people, it might be the last time they look at some of the emails from us. So over the holiday, they can be going around and photographing some of those locations and getting geared up for submitting some images for the gallery opening at the Art Center with us. So those are the notes that I have.
Okay, so. Good. Thanks, Joe. So even though we have a couple of weeks off here for the holidays, it's going to pick right up very quickly when we come back in January. And we really are looking forward to that exhibit, which will be held at the Mechanicsburg Art Center. So please think about, photographing some images of the historical sites, or actually it can be anything within the historical areas, and think about submitting a couple of prints, for the exhibit. We want to have lots and lots of prints. Okay, let me share my screen and we'll get right to it here. 2 weeks ago, I started a presentation on providing some tips for you for photographing in harsh light. And I thought about it a lot since then and made some slight revisions. So I think it wise that I start back at the beginning tonight and kind of zip through the first part and then get into the second half of the presentation, which I didn't have time for 2 weeks ago. This is based on my experience during the month of May this past year, when my wife and I did a car trip where we traveled 6,300 miles in about 28 days, and went out west, visited more than a dozen national parks and monuments, and just had a great experience and photographing. And of course, we were photographing, I was photographing a large part of the time in harsh light. The weather was good, fortunately, most of the time, but it meant that, you know, we were traveling, and then we were at these monuments and national parks during like 9, 10 o'clock until 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And as I say, most of it was during harsh light times. So let's first look very quickly at the characteristics of harsh light so we know what we're dealing with. Harsh light typically, well, you look at 4 characteristics of light. And the first one is direction. And harsh light, as we define it, is usually coming from above. The light that you typically get during midday. Its an intensity is, yeah, it's bright. Okay, and that by itself isn't necessarily a problem because we can control that. The quality is the issue, because with bright light, it's very contrasty. There are very dark shadows and very bright highlights. And the dynamic range is what really causes the problem or the challenge for us, because there's such a drastic range from the very, very dark shadows to the very bright highlights, that even though our eyes can see detail in both, our cameras are just physically unable, mechanically unable to capture that great an intensity range. So we want to talk about ways to deal with that. And the color of harsh light, it usually has a bluish tinge to it, you know, as compared to sunrise and sunset when they have a more orangish, reddish color. Okay, so there are 3 approaches, and this is, I basically revised this part of the presentation because honestly, I felt that I was a little bit harsh on harsh light, because it's not all bad. Okay, there are basically 3 approaches you can take. And the first one, as I talked about last week, is you can try to avoid harsh light. And here are some ways you can do that. Number 1, shoot at sunrise or sunset. Okay, then the characteristics of light are very different. They're not, the light is not harsh. It's a much coming from a different direction. It's much softer. The shadows aren't as dark. The highlights aren't as bright, so you don't have as great a dynamic range. The color's different. It's more of a reddish orange. So you have photographically a more pleasing light. Another way to do it is to wait for a cloudy day. Okay, that also changes the characteristics of light. So it's not harsh, it's diffused. The quality is the biggest issue. That's the one we can't, we have the most trouble controlling. So on a cloudy day, nature has taken care of that for us. It has provided a soft box with the diffuser. Very nice. Or even on a bright sunny day, you can look for areas that are not in the harsh light. They're in the shadow. For instance, on the left, we've got Zion Canyon, and the bright light came down and reflected off the canyon walls, and the colors were picked up in the reflection off the water. And I knew that I could bring that out in post when I saw it, because it wasn't quite as obvious as it is in the picture, but I enhanced it in post to bring those colors out. But the quality of the light is the same as it was there. The light, the bluish light picks up the reddish color, from the walls of the canyon, and then it also gets diffused, of course, during that reflection process. Or you could be in like a slot canyon, or in this case, Bryce Canyon on the right, and the light again comes down. It's pretty much overhead. It's harsh light to begin with, but it gets reflected off the canyon walls. During the process of being reflected, it picks up that reddish color of the minerals in the soil. The direction changes because it's now not coming from above, it's reflected off the canyon walls, and the color improves, it gets warmer, the direction changes. Oh, the quality. Now, instead of the light coming from one direction, it bounces all over the place and gives you a very nice, soft light that would even be good for portraits. As I said last week, here I moved my wife Joyce into the shade of one of these cave dwellings in Arizona and took advantage of being in the shade, get out of the harsh light. When you do this, a lot of times the color picks, or the image picks up a bluish cast, from the daylight, the harsh light. So the blue sky is reflecting light or shining light back in under the cave. So it ends up being bluish, which is the image down here on the right. So what you can do in post, of course, is just change the white balance, or you can do it in camera so that you get a warmer tone that's more pleasing to the eye. So all of these ways of avoiding harsh light, because it makes the light more photographic, more photogenic, and it changes the direction, intensity, color, and quality of the light to be more pleasing. Approach number two, and this is the one where I really changed my attitude. I thought, geez, there's so many things you can do with harsh light. And I mentioned a couple of these last week, like these two images. Take advantage of the strong shadows that are created by this harsh light. Okay, that gives you a unique look for sure. Or you could create a sunburst. And I mentioned this last week. It's simply a byproduct of using a small aperture like f/16. And it helps then to position the camera so that the sun is behind some object or just protruding from behind some object. In this case, a cliff and an opening in the cliff, or it could be a statue, it could be a tree limb or whatever. But because you have a darker area in front of the cliff here, then the spikes, that the sun flares show up dramatically and give you a really nice dramatic look. Do be aware, though, that the appearance of the sunburst will change drastically depending on the lens you are using. Certain lenses, in this case, it was the Canon L series lens 16 to 35 millimeter, that gave me this very clean, what I like, very much like the look of this particular sunburst. When I used the 70 to 200 millimeter lens, got a decent sunburst, but it didn't look this clean and sharp and didn't have as many spikes. The spikes are dependent on the number of blades in the lens aperture. Okay? So it will vary, from lens to lens. And what you'll notice if you try to do this with an iPhone or a smartphone is you'll have a lot of difficulty. You probably will be totally unable to get the sunburst effect, just because the aperture is very different and it just doesn't work very well. The other possibility, of course, that's pretty dramatic are silhouettes. Okay, and this is at Bryce Canyon, 4:19 in the afternoon. So the sun is still bright, still harsh, but I was able to position myself so that these folks were in the shadow, and then underexpose the image a bit. And it helped when I took it into post to not only decrease the overall exposure a little bit, but use the black slider and move the black slider over to the left, because in a true silhouette, you really don't want to see detail in the silhouette. Okay, so I wanted to darken the darkest shadows, which are the people, so you don't see any detail at all. It was nice that a little bit of moon was available that day too, to add a little accent. Now here's something else you can try, which is more dramatic, but you really have to be intentional with your camera settings. I was inside a building, and this was one of the recreated Western villages in Utah. And I thought, well, it would be neat if I just saw the highlighted areas and that they were properly exposed. And I'm just going to let the dark areas go completely black. Okay. So in this case, it's just a single image, and I just exposed for the sunlit part and left everything else go black. So you get a very dramatic image this way sometimes under the right conditions. And I've seen people like David Duchemin do this very effectively. Okay. And of course, it's a technique that works very well when you have harsh light. There's two other ways to approach this. Or, well, another way is backlighting. And in this case, I've got some street ornaments in Sedona, Arizona. And I just positioned myself so that the sun was right behind the pinkish one. And of course, the light shining through and it makes it look like those globes, colored globes, are illuminated, okay, from within. Well, they're not, they're illuminated by the sunshine, but could expose just for the bright sky. So the sky turns a nice, pleasant blue, and boom, those spheres just light up. The other approach is, here I did a starburst effect again, but I didn't put the image in for that reason. I wanted you to see the backlighting, and you'll notice the spikes and the little hairy details on the limbs of this cactus. The backlighting gives you what they call rim lighting, where it outlines, the cactus or whatever other plant or, whatever you have there, or person, and just makes those little fibers, boom, light up, and gives you a very nice and very interesting outline of the plant. Okay, so backlighting can be very effective in harsh light. Now, what we really wanted to get into was, well, what do you do if you're shooting in harsh light? And I changed the approach to taming. Try to do things to keep the harsh light under control and minimize some of the characteristics, especially the harsh quality of the light. We mentioned shooting in RAW, so I won't spend a lot of time because we went into this before, but and you probably have heard this before, there are advantages to shooting RAW. I mean, if you shoot JPEG, yes, you can still get some great shots, but dealing with harsh light becomes a little easier when you're shooting RAW, and here are the reasons. There are basically, three reasons, three advantages that RAW files have over JPEG files. The one is the dynamic range. RAW files are just simply able to capture a greater range of light values from the darkest to the brightest. Okay, more stops of light, if you will, than a JPEG image. RAW files have a greater bit depth. Now, bit depth refers to the number of different values, the gradations in colors that you get. And if you've ever seen this in an image of yours, or you've seen it somewhere, this banding effect, as they call it, is typically due to a limited bit depth, as you would get with a JPEG file, because JPEGs only have what they call 8 bits, and they're only able to record 256 different shades. So when you're in a sky like this, where it goes from pretty bright to pretty dark, you get a lot of gradations, and with a JPEG file, it may not be able to render those smoothly. Okay, you can also see this sometimes in facial tones. If you get somebody's face and you look across the cheek, you might see a banding effect if it was taken with a JPEG file. But RAW files have a greater bit depth. They can handle many, many, many more shades of color or shades of gray, and you're not likely to get banding with a RAW file. RAW files are also not compressed the same way the JPEG files are. See, JPEG files process your image according to the settings in the camera, in what they call the picture styles. You can change these, but you have to do that ahead of time as shooting. You can change how much sharpness the camera applies, how much saturation, how much contrast. But once you have that set in the picture style, when you shoot a JPEG file, the camera processes it with those settings and then discards the information that it doesn't need and compresses, the file according to the JPEG compression standards, right? So you end up with, well, you didn't get a lot of data to begin with because it was an 8-bit JPEG file. And then when it discards what it doesn't need after it compresses the image, you end up with even less. So with a RAW file, they might be compressed, but in a different way, okay, and not nearly as severely. So you're getting more complete data. You're getting more of all the data that was, captured by the sensor in the camera. Okay, so shooting in RAW will help. Now, I only advise you, if you don't shoot RAW right now, if you're shooting JPEG, I only advise you to think about converting to RAW if you're willing to do the processing, because raw files have to be processed. Okay, you have to use a program like Lightroom or On1 or Capture One, or a program that's considered a raw converter, because the program has to take the data that the camera supplies in that raw format and convert it into an image that you can see. We can't see raw files. So when you shoot raw, what you're seeing is a JPEG representation. On the back of the camera, you're seeing a JPEG that the camera created. When you take it into Lightroom, you're seeing a JPEG image. You're not seeing the raw file. You're seeing the JPEG image that Lightroom presents with the settings that you have with the sliders to give you an image that you can see, but it comes from a raw file, which means then it has more integrity. There's more data to work with. You have greater latitude in processing. All right. So if you're willing to, if you're eager, maybe would be the word, eager and willing to do the processing, in one of those conversion files programs. Advise you to shoot at 100 ISO, which is usually easy in harsh light because it's bright. Okay, there's plenty of light. And the reason you do that is because at 100 ISO, or whatever the native base ISO of your camera is, you have the greatest dynamic range. You've all seen those pictures that you've taken indoors at high ISOs, let's say 6,400, 12,000, and they don't look very good. They're blotchy, the color doesn't look quite right and rich. Well, part of that is because of the noise that's generated, and you can deal with noise with noise reduction software. But a large part of that funky look that the picture gets is because of the decrease in the dynamic range. Okay, at high ISOs, the files can no longer adequately capture and display the darkest darks and the brightest brights. Okay, so you run into a problem there with dynamic range. Pardon me. It's critical that you do not overexpose the highlights. I don't care if you're shooting RAW or JPEG. Don't overexpose the highlights. When information is lost in the highlights, if it's truly lost, it can't be regained. You can't take it into a software program like Lightroom and simply move a slider and bring that detail back. Now, what can be a little confusing sometimes is that the JPEG image that you see on the back of your camera might indicate that you've overexposed some areas. And you may have, but then again, maybe not. So what you want to do is, well, let's get into that. You want to be careful about that. Don't overreact. And of course, if it's an overexposed area like the sun or street lamps at night, that's not an issue, okay? Because we don't expect to see detail in the sun or in those street lamps. So they're specular highlights that you can overexpose without concern, okay? And be aware that a raw file, if you're shooting raw, be aware that the raw file is not going to look great, okay? Even if it's been properly exposed on the back of the camera, or when you bring it into Lightroom at first, or in whatever your processing software program is. Number one, if you properly expose a raw file, you have captured as much information as you possibly can. And if you look at the histogram, it's going to be over toward the right-hand side without being bunched up against the right-hand side of the histogram. Some people refer to this as exposing to the right, and it simply means that you're capturing as much detail because a lot of, mathematically, a lot of the information, in a picture, a digital file, exists at the brightest end of the image. So if you intentionally underexpose an image, you're not capturing as much detail as you could, and therefore you are limiting your processing possibilities, later on. So don't be concerned if your histogram is looking like this. Do be concerned if it's squished up against the right-hand side of the graph. So what you do is, do you have an image like this? Yeah, that's a good exposure. then you take it into Lightroom or your program, and you just adjust it to look more pleasing. Your first goal is to capture as much information as you can. The goal is not to get a good looking image. That's the second step. With a raw file, the first step is capture as much information as you can with the understanding that it's not going to look good right away. Second step, adjust it in Lightroom or your program to get it to look the way you want it. Okay, two-step process. So the first thing everybody should be doing is you should be enabling blinkies on your camera, because when your camera displays that JPEG file in the back, if there's a part that it thinks is overexposed, it's going to scream at you. It's going to blink. Okay, so that's a good indication. So what you do then is you look at it and you determine, hey, is there important information there in those areas? And if there is, then you probably want to reshoot. Okay, and you want to reduce the exposure. So the question I'm asking is, have you enabled blinkies yet? And if you haven't, I'd go and look for your camera, figure out how to do that. But you have to go into a menu item and don't look for blinkies, because that's not what the camera manufacturers call it. They're called highlight alert. So look for highlight alert, and it'll be in the playback or display menu, and just enable them. It's a simple thing to do, but it's a way to protect your highlights. So check the histogram. Here's an example where the camera felt that this was a proper exposure, because it looked at the image and overall it averaged the scene together. And yeah, there's some bright spots, but yeah, there's some dark spots. And overall, yeah, the camera said, yeah, this will give you a good exposure. Well, no, it didn't give me a good exposure, because the camera didn't realize when it averaged the scene that this sky was totally overexposed, as you can see from the histogram. Okay. And these areas are, yeah, they're not too bad, actually. They're a little dark, but you see down here, those areas are represented by the left-hand side of the histogram. But I'm not so much worried about the darks. I'm mainly concerned, because I can bring up some detail in the shadows, in Lightroom. And I'll talk about Lightroom. Please understand, when I say Lightroom, I really mean whatever processing program you're using. I just happen to use Lightroom. It's here where we're concerned. So I'm looking at this and the blinkies are going, and they're saying overexposed. And I say, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And I look at the histogram and go, oh yeah, it's overexposed. So this would require reshooting. Okay. So question to ask yourself, do you know how to quickly access the histogram to check an image like that? It only takes a second, but it's a good thing to do. And usually you do that by hitting the info button on the back of your camera. You might have to hit it a couple of times, because most cameras toggle through several different screens. Okay, and one of them, at least one of them, will have a histogram, on it. And just very quickly, notice that the RGB values show up separately. I have a red, green, and the blue graph here, and I can see the individual color channels separately. Now, this can be advantageous, because if you're taking a picture of something like, well, Red Rock Canyons or a red flower, like a rose, the red might be overexposed, and the red and green channels, the blue and green channels aren't. But if any one channel is overexposed, you're going to lose detail, and it's not going to look good. Okay, so this would tell you, a graph like this, that the RGB histogram would tell you if any individual color is overexposed, or if they're all overexposed. All right. Okay, we're soon going to be to the part where we ended 2 weeks ago, but a little bit before that, just protecting the highlights. When you reduce the exposure, you can, one way to do it, of course, if you're in manual exposure, is you just decrease the exposure by using a faster shutter speed, lets in less light, or a smaller aperture. Okay, and we're already supposedly at the 100 ISO, so that wouldn't change, but just change one of the other two settings. And if you're in one of the semi-automatic modes like shutter priority or aperture priority, then you need to use exposure compensation, okay, which allows you to dial in as much underexposure or overexposure as you want on the scale like this. And most cameras, you can access the exposure compensation screen through the quick access screen on the back of the camera. On Canons, it's the Q button. Okay, but look on your camera to see how to access that, and you should understand how to change the exposure, especially in this case, underexpose the image, to avoid overexposing the highlights. Now, if I underexpose the image, I might end up with something like this. Now, this is reminiscent of the image I took at the Western Village inside the room of the dark interior and the bright outside. And you might say, hey, that's fine. I like this image. I'm going to stick with this. That's great. It's another interpretation where you're displaying the highlights, the sky and the peaks that are illuminated, and not so much worried about the shadow areas. Okay, so that's certainly acceptable if that's what you want. But if you want an image, there, got to mute a few people, thank you. If you want an image that has detail in both the highlights and the shadows, you've got to take another approach, because you can't get that with one image. If you expose, for the shadows, you get something that looks like that. If you expose for the highlights, you get something that looks like that. So to get detail in both the highlights and the shadows, you can't do it with just one single image. You have to bracket your exposures. Okay. And, I think the move now is to refer to these not as so much as HDR, which was, that's the process of combining the bracketed exposures. But a lot of people now are just referring to bracketed exposures and blending bracketed exposures, because HDR got such a bad name, over the years. I mentioned 2 weeks ago that many cameras will do in-camera HDR, okay, but all the ones that I'm aware of use JPEG files, and your composite is a JPEG file. So you are limited then within the dynamic range and the compression values of the JPEG images, JPEG files. So I actually recommend that you don't do it in camera, that you do it, that you use RAW files, and you shoot 3 RAW files, bracketed exposures, and we take them into your program like Lightroom. Lightroom actually blends them together, and the composite is also a RAW file. It happens to be a DNG format, but it's a RAW file. So you have much more flexibility then in processing that composite after the software blends it. Now, you can do exposure bracketing manually. Okay, it's fairly easy, just spin some dials. It's much easier to do automatic bracketing, exposure bracketing. And here's an example. What you might end up with is when you read the scene, you read the meter, it might say to you, oh, the proper exposure is 1/200th of a second at f11. And I'm sticking with 100 ISO. Well, if you go 2 stops under, we're keeping the aperture the same, okay, because we don't want the depth of field to change. Okay. So I would recommend doing the bracketed exposures on manual setting, changing the shutter speed, or use aperture priority, because then the aperture won't change, the shutter speed will. Okay. But in any case, if you're using RAW files, they usually recommend a 2-stop difference. So if I underexpose the image by 2 stops, the shutter speed goes to 1/800th of a second. Aperture stays at f11. ISO stays at 100. If you go 2 stops over, then the camera shoots that image at 1/50th of a second. Okay. Now, this is what you end up with. Something that looks like this. 2 stops under, right on the meter reading, 2 stops over. So what you want to look for, okay, you would ask yourself, well, is this a successful series of bracketed images? Yes, it is, and here's why. You look at the darkest image and you look for the highlights. What was the brightest area? Well, the sky was very bright, and so So was this area, pardon me, let me mute a person. So was this area down here in the lower left. So I look at this image that's two stopped underexposed and I go, oh yeah, I see plenty of detail here and in the sky. In fact, the sky's a little dark. So I'm good there. Now you look at the other extreme, two stops overexposed. Am I good there? Well, look, have people coming on board and they're not muted and I can hear them. So we'll mute those folks as they come on. I look at the image, the two stop overexposed, and I say, well, where was the darkest area? And it was down here in the canyon. And I say to myself, well, can I see detail there in what was the darkest part of the image? And I say, yeah, I can see detail. It looks fine. So I would consider this to be a successful bracketed sequence. 3 images, two stops under, right on, 2 stops over. Okay, so a successful sequence. And as I say, you can do that manually and you can do it handheld. Okay, if you just get used to spinning the dial, and if I'm spinning the dial changing, let's say I'm on manual and I'm spinning the dial changing the shutter speed, I know that my camera, each click, you know, when you spin that down, it goes click, you can feel the bump and you hear a click. Each click is 1/3 of a stop, which means that if I go click, 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 3 clicks is 1 stop. That means 6 clicks is 2 stops. So what I typically would do if I didn't have it set up for automatic exposure bracketing, I would take a meter reading, move the shutter speed until it was 2 stops under. Okay, the one on the left, 1/800th of a second. Okay, I would hold it steady, take a picture, and I would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I hear 6 little clicks. I know I don't even have to look at the meter. I know that's 2 stops. Boom, I take another picture. Then I go click, 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 6 clicks. I know that's another 2 stops. And now I have the bracketed sequence of 3, 2 stops apart. 6 clicks, 6 clicks. I usually start at the dark end, you know, start it with the fastest shutter speed, because then I can just keep going in the same direction with turning my dial at the top of the camera. 6 clicks each time. Okay. So after processing, I did say after processing, because the image did not look like this. You know, you get a raw file from the HDR processing, but it didn't look this good. So I'm saying to you, this is what the image looked like after the composite was created from the 3 images, the bracketed sequence, and after I processed it. And we'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute. And we'll take a break before we get into the processing part, and I can address questions that you might have. So do you know how to set automatic bracketing on your camera? Well, it's a little too complicated to get into, and it's so different, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, for every camera that I won't get into the details. I would recommend you go to YouTube and watch a video. Just search for AEB, automatic exposure bracketing, and put in your particular camera make and model. And there'll be a video that'll come up to show you how to set it up for your camera. And when you do that, also use burst mode. Okay, why? Oh, because then you don't even have to press the shutter button 3 times. You just hold the camera steady, hold the button down, and boom, 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 the camera takes 3 pictures automatically, 2 under, right on, 2 stops over, and you have your bracketed sequence. Now, in almost all cameras, well, in the cameras that I'm familiar with, the default would give you, here's how it shoots the images. It shoots the one that it thinks is the right exposure first, and then it goes 2 stops under and then 2 stops over. Well, you know what? For some reason, I get confused when I see those. When I come into Lightroom and I see them down there, it makes more sense for me to see the dark one, the lighter one, and the brightest one in order. So I went into the menus in my camera and I changed it so the sequence it shoots now is 2 stops under, right on, 2 stops over. So I get them in Lightroom and I see darkest, brighter, brightest. Just makes more sense to me. Okay, this is where we were last week. So I'll get through a couple things here and then we'll take a break for questions before we get into processing. Polarizing filters can be very, very helpful for taming harsh light. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about how polarizing filters work and the details, but I put together an information sheet for the class that just ended. Well, Rod was in the class and he already has it. It was on creative camera techniques. And you'll be able to download that tomorrow in the follow-up email. I'll send a link out and that'll give you more details about polarizing filters. But basically, a polarizing filter will allow you to make the sky bluer, and therefore the clouds, white clouds, look whiter, okay, by comparison. You can increase the color saturation of vegetation. How? Well, because when the sunlight reflects off the shiny surface of the leaves, it becomes polarized. Your polarizing filter can cut that glare. That polarized light is the glare. It cuts it, and what you have left then is a more saturated color image, okay, without the glare, and a reduced dynamic range, which enables your camera then to capture that more readily. You can also reduce distracting reflections on water and glass, like the polarizing sunglasses, the fishermen use. That works. And it also reduces haze in the background of scenes. So it can be very, very helpful. And when I asked last time about 2 weeks ago about how many people used polarizing filters within the last 30 days, 22 people out of the 43 who responded said yes, they had used a polarizer within the last 30 days. When I was out west, I was switching between two different lenses a lot, the 16 to 35 and the 70 to 200. And I only had one polarizing filter. So guess what that meant? Every time I switched lenses, I had to switch the polarizing filter too. Oh, what a pain that was. As soon as I got home, I put an order in from B&H for a second polarizing filter. So now when I run into that situation again, I'll have a polarizing filter on each lens, and I'll just have to change the lens with the filter. I won't have to be messing around with changing filters, especially when I was out in a rugged territory in the cliffs, and and I'm changing lenses, and I'm afraid the lens is going to, and the filter is going to roll down the cliff. Just obnoxious, just painstaking. Anyway, here's a quick example. This is at Gerhardt Machinery a couple of months ago when the club went there. 11:13 a.m. And on the left, no polarizer. And look at the difference on the right. A couple things. Look at the sky, how it has become bluer, as indicated. Look at the water has become bluer. And look at the green grass. You can see it's more saturated here than here. And that's because the polarizer removes the reflection from the blades of grass. Okay, so it can greatly improve the look of your picture, as long as you don't overdo it. As you know, when you twist that polarizer, it goes from no effect practically to a maximum within 90-degree twist. And usually maximum is not where you want to leave the polarizer. It's just a little too much. So back off the maximum and get the color enhancement without going overboard. Okay. The other way to deal with harsh light, if you're doing something like this, is to use a flash or a reflector. Okay? If you're not familiar with electronic flash, don't know how to use it, just go with a reflector, have somebody stand near you and reflect that sunlight. Position the people so the sun is to their backs. What you're trying to avoid is having that harsh light shine on their faces to give you those ugly shadows. So turn them so their backs are to the sun, and then have the reflector shining light back into their faces. Or if you're good with electronic flash, just throw that on, throw some light back in their faces, and it'll greatly improve the look of your images. So in summary, for shooting, if you're trying to avoid harsh light, shoot early or late in the day, shoot on a cloudy day, or at least wait for a cloud to pass in front of the sun to diffuse the light. Look for reflected light, okay, because it greatly enhances the characteristics of harsh light. or move your subject into the shade. If you're going to take advantage of the harsh light, look for strong shadows, use the sun as an interesting compositional element, create silhouettes, accent the highlights, okay, and photograph backlit subjects. Yes. Oh, if you're trying to tame the harsh light, shoot raw. If you have a choice, or if you're willing to accept the processing, keep your ISO low, protect the highlights. Okay, bracket your exposures if you want to get into HDR, if you want to see detail in the highlights and the shadows. Use a polarizer and consider using a flash or a reflector if you have subjects that are close to you. Okay, guys, let's take a slight break there and I'll respond to any questions. Just unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment. Then we'll get into processing. Anybody out there?
Yeah, Dennis, hi, it's Rich Scar. Can you hear me?
Hi, Rich. Yeah.
Hello there. Yeah, I'm out in the great territory, not far from where you're shooting. I'm out at the Boulder, Colorado, out by the Flatirons. I'm going out in the early morning to shoot some. But let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. I think you've answered probably a number of times, or has been raised and answered, and that is that a polarizer filter. I've played with it some, but do you feel that polarizer filter is better than waiting until you get into Lightroom or Photoshop and doing some of the correction there, the dehaze, etc.?
Yes, because a polarizer can do something for you that Lightroom cannot do. Lightroom, you can use the dehaze filter to cut back some of the haze in the distance, but Lightroom, there's no way that Lightroom can reduce the glare off the vegetation. Now, I will show you here in the next session about how you can make the sky bluer in Lightroom. That's fairly simple, but it will not increase the saturation by cutting the glare. And that's a very important reason to use a polarizing filter.
Okay, good point. Thank you.
And keep in mind that a polarizing filter is very different from a neutral density filter. The neutral density filter just blocks light uniformly from the scene. A polarizer is selective in that it only blocks the polarized light. Okay? And if you're outside, the key to using a polarizer effectively is to go in two steps. One is you look where the sun is positioned, and the polarizer is only going to have an effect at a 90-degree angle to the sun. Oh, well, let me think. If I'm shooting at sunrise or sunset and I'm shooting toward the sun or away from the sun, that's 0 degrees or 180. That's not going to work. That's right. A polarizing filter has little or no effect. Well, it still could help with the vegetation a little bit, okay? But it won't darken the sky if you're directly toward or directly away from the sun. If you want the sky darkening effect, then think of 90 degrees. Just if the sun is, wherever the sun is, shoot at a 90-degree angle, okay, to the sun. If it's overhead, you can shoot anywhere along the horizon and you're shooting at a 90-degree angle. You're going to get the maximum darkening effect in the sky. So the bottom line is, if you're looking to darken the sky, be aware of the position of the sun and look for that 90-degree angle. But it doesn't hurt to leave your polarizing filter on all the time when you're shooting outside.
Just put it 0.
Just leave it on. It'll help. If it doesn't help with the darkening of the blue sky, at least it'll help with reducing, cutting out some of the glare from the vegetation.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Great. So download a copy of that worksheet or the info sheet tomorrow on polarized light. That'll give you a little more detail.
Cool.
Okay.
A simple way to tell the direction of the sun with a polarizer is to look at your shadow. If your shadow is to the left or to the right, your polarizer will work fine.
Good, Dick. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'll tell you a little secret, something I didn't know until I was doing the research on that info sheet. You know, a lot of times in the past, I wouldn't have my polarizer on the lens, and I would take it out of the case and I'd hold it up and just turn it, twist it to see if it would have any effect. And I realized after doing the research that you have to be careful the way it's oriented, like which side you have facing you. You have to have the side facing you that would be facing the camera. So you turn the threads as if you're going to, screw it onto your camera, the threads need to be toward you. If you have it flipped the other way around, you won't see the polarizing effect. Oh, and I did say, I was getting the two-step process. The first step is to look for the position of the sun if you're concerned about darkening, and you go maximum effects of 90 degrees. And the second step then, of course, is to spin or rotate the polarizer, because within 90 degrees of rotating it, you're going to you go from the minimum to the maximum effect. And the maximum is usually too much, so just back off that a little bit. Okay. And the other little secret I learned through experience is always rotate the polarizer in this direction. You know why? Because when you rotate it in this direction, it unscrews and falls off. That happened to me. Yep, always turn it the other way now. Okay, any other questions before I get into processing? Okay, this isn't going to be complicated, and I won't take long, but a few tips on processing. And I'm going to talk about Lightroom, but as I said, just imagine I'm talking about whatever other program you use, like on one, Mike. Okay, if you have created an exposure bracketed sequence of images in Lightroom, it's extremely easy to put them together, to blend them. So here's what my bracket might look like: 2 stops under, right on, that's the meter reading, and 2 stops over. So again, I can see, there's detail. The brightest areas of the image were up here and along this edge. Oh yeah, they look good in 2 stops under. Okay, no, nothing looks good there. And you go 2 stops over, well, even down in the crevice here in the canyon, I can see some detail. So I should be good. I've covered all the extremes. What you might run into on a bracketed sequence would be that even though you've done 2 under, right on, and 2 over, they're all still too bright. That can happen. Okay, so what you can do then on your camera is there's a way to move that whole bracketed series to the left to underexpose all of the images. So they would still be separated by 2 stops, but instead of the middle one being the 0 meter reading, it might be -1. So this one then would become -2 stops. This would be -1, and this would be +1. So they're still separated by 2, but everything's shifted over by a stop. Okay, so this is what the bracketed series would look like. I take it into Lightroom, and they're down here: 1, 2, 3, darkest, brighter, brightest. I simply select all 3 images and I right click. When you right click, you get this option says photo merge, and one of them is HDR. Boom, you hit that and you're on your way. Okay, Lightroom puts all 3 together. These were raw files, and it creates a composite, which is a raw file in DNG format, and hopefully it'll show detail in the highlights and in the shadows, and which is here. This is the image then that Lightroom came up with, and notice that it doesn't look quite as good as the one on the right. Well, this one's before the processing. It's an HDR, it's the composite, but I had to do some manipulating in Lightroom to get it to look this way. And honestly, this is more of what it actually looked like, okay, when I was there. Okay, so how did I get it to look that way? Well, very simply. Here's a screenshot from what I did in Lightroom. Here's the unprocessed image, and these are the sliders. So the white balance was simply whatever the camera shot it at the automatic white balance. Look at this. This is interesting. The automatic white balance in the camera set it at 4,350 degrees Kelvin. Now, if you know much about white balance, you know that, wow, that's really cool. That's a bluish image. Daylight, okay, harsh light is like 5,500. Sunset is like 6,500 or 7,000. So the larger the number, the warmer the image becomes. So all I had to do to bring back a warmth this red glow to the image was change the white balance to what it should be for a daylight image. I didn't even go more towards sunset. I just went with 5500. I had to move this myself, change the slider, say it's a custom setting, but just by changing the white balance, I brought the warmth, back into the image. Then the other things are things that I would typically do to almost any image that I shoot outdoors. In this case, look at the exposure. This is right on. Well, I think that's too bright. Okay, as I said before, if you capture a raw file properly, it's going to look too bright. Okay, then you change the settings in post to get it to look the way you want it to look. This required me to underexpose the image by almost 2 stops. Okay, now if I would look at the histogram, this image was properly exposed. It was not overexposed. Well, it's the composite from a bracketed sequence. Okay, but the composite would not look overexposed either. Okay? And this one, of course, is not overexposed either, but underexposing by almost 2 stops. And then the other standard things, highlights, boom, you want to pull down, decrease the highlights, increase the shadows. Because what you're doing now is you're countering the dynamic range. Those bright brights, you're bringing them down under control even a little bit more, decreasing the value of the brightest areas of the picture. That's what this does. This increases the values of the darkest areas. So I'm bringing up the shadows, decreasing the highlights. The whites and the blacks, they give you your contrast range. So if you work in Lightroom, what you do is hold down the Alt key and then click on the slider and you move it until you see some, of the detail coming back into the image there. That's a little trick that we won't get into all of that. But typically what happens is almost always the blacks are going to require you decrease the black slider a little bit and increase the white slider a little bit. The difference there gives you your contrast. These are the darkest darks. These are the brightest whites. Okay. And on scenes like this, where there's a lot of grit, a lot of texture, I typically increase the texture a little bit and the clarity a little bit. Okay. Didn't need to change the dehaze because there's no haze involved. It's not a distant scene. And I did increase the vibrance just a little bit, made it +10. Okay. And that made the colors even richer, the blues bluer and the reds redder. And you got to be careful with that because it's easy to overdo it. And of course, it's important to mention that I almost never use saturation. I use vibrance instead. Think of vibrance as a smart saturation. If you increase the saturation slider, it just increases all values, all color values equally. Well, the reds are already pretty saturated. So that would simply oversaturate the reds. So with the vibrance, as I said, it's a smart saturation. It only increases the values, the saturation values of the colors that are not already really saturated. So it's more of an equalizer. It equalizes the saturation and only saturates the colors that aren't already oversaturated. So that's really a pretty basic, that's the basic panel in Lightroom, and that's how I handle, well, most all my images, not just images that were taken in harsh light. And then a couple other things that are important to mention, I think. There's a real easy trick for increasing the blue in the sky, okay, to make it look more like this instead of like that. If you don't, especially if you don't use a polarizer, okay? So what you can do is you go into the HSL slider or panel in Lightroom. Click on saturation. Here you have U is the actual color. So if you click on U and you move a slider, it's going to change the color from blue to something else. So what you want to do is you want to affect the saturation and the luminance. The luminance is the brightness a little bit, each one a little bit. So you click on saturation first, and then the easiest way to do it is click on this little thingy right here. It's called the TAT, the Targeted Adjustment Tool. and you click on that, and you go up into the picture on the sky and click and drag up, a little bit up, meaning you're going to increase the saturation of the blue sky just a little bit. The target adjustment tool goes on whatever color you want to affect. And in this case, we're talking about the sky. So you put your cursor on the sky, the TAT on the sky, click and drag up to increase the saturation just a little bit. Then the second part of the process is you come in here and click luminance, and you click on the sky and drag down because you want to decrease the brightness of the sky. Makes it look more bluish, darker blue. Okay, so that's how you go from a sky like this on the left to a sky like this. Okay, richer blue. And actually, this is the way it looked. My wife said to me a couple of times, she said, "I can't believe how blue the sky looks out here. It's bluer than I've ever seen the sky before." Okay, so that's a little trick for increasing the blueness of the sky, especially if you don't use a polarizer. Increase the saturation a little and decrease the luminance a little. The other thing you want to do to your images is make sure that you sharpen them a little bit. In Lightroom, go to the sharpening panel, and it's important that you mask. If this masking were over to 0, it means that the sharpening would be applied to the entire image. So what you do in Lightroom is you hold down the Alt key, you click on masking and drag it, and then you can see that Lightroom the sharpening just affects the edges. So you don't want to sharpen the sky. Okay, it just gets funky. Okay, so by masking it, you mask out the sky, you don't sharpen that, it just sharpens the edges. Your image will look good, overall. If you're shooting at 100 ISO, you don't need to do any noise reduction other than what the defaults are in Lightroom. I like to add a slight darkening vignette. Okay, darken the edges just a wee little bit. Not enough that people say, "Oh, that's a nice vignette you put on that picture." Just enough to unconsciously draw the viewer's eye in toward the middle of the picture. So I might go like a -15 on and leave it on highlight priority. Then the other thing you want to do is eliminate distractions in your pictures. That's just a common theme. And in almost all cases, unless it's a dust spots you can remove in Lightroom. Almost anything else, you need to go into Photoshop. And if you're not sure how to do that, of course, take my class or check out some YouTube videos that show you how to do it. But I love this picture, but I could not wait long enough for these idiots to get out of the picture. I mean, these people to get out of the picture. They just were having a little picnic there, a little gab session. So I said, "Okay, you're making extra work for me, but I'll take the picture now and deal with you later." So I eliminated them using most of the clone stamp tool, in Photoshop. Now you notice the other little thing I did up here. I've got this sunburst effect, but there's a little area of sky there that's completely blown out. So again, I used the clone tool and I duplicated some of these leaves on the tree over that sky area, just so I wouldn't have that, blaring out at us. So removing distractions in Photoshop. Now, if you want to take your images to the next level, here's how you do it. You do a little dodging and burning. Okay, you can do this in Lightroom or in Photoshop. It's easy and quick in Lightroom, but not quite as precise. If you do it in Photoshop, then you have to learn how to use layers and layer masks. But just want to show you a couple examples. I'm not going to explain the process, except that what I typically do is I'll take an image like this in Arizona, Flagstaff, and I decrease the exposure by 1 to 2 stops. Just make the whole image darker. Then I go back in either in Lightroom or Photoshop, and I brighten the areas that I want you to pay attention to. So I might use a radial filter and go in and put one here and brighten up this car, and put another one here and brighten up this car, put another one here, brighten this sign, put another one here, brighten his face, put another one over here. And what it does is just, where you can see from the examples, it gives more depth and in contrast to the image, and just gives it a richness that some people say looks more like a painting. Here are a couple other examples. This was dramatic out in the Badlands. I like this buggy But boy, the picture that came out, the raw file looked like this. And I processed it then and brightened the buggy. Look at the detail in the buggy. Here you can't see much detail. It's just dark because it's backlit. See the shadow down here? Almost high noon. Okay, well, yeah, 1:21 p.m. And I'm on the shadow side, so almost no detail. So I could bring out the detail. And what's neat in Lightroom now with the new masking tools, this becomes so much easier. I simply put a radial filter, okay, all around this. I didn't have to worry about meticulously using a brush to brighten those little areas. No. The software does it for you. Lightroom will take care of it. Just brighten up that whole area, and then you can tell it just to look at the car, look at the subject, or just select the subject, okay, and brighten it. And then the background, darkened it, changed the color a little bit to make it look more like it looked when I was there. Another example, it's out in Jerome, Arizona, and I asked this guy if I could take his picture, and he just laughed and said, well, why would you want to take my picture? I said, you look pretty cool. So this is the original, and then this is after a little dodging and burning. I cropped, of course, straightened it, brightened him up, darkened the whole image first. Okay, you can see, look at the windows back here. Look how bright they are here, how dark they are over here. So darken the whole image and then brighten the parts that I want you to see. What do I want you to see? Of course, the biker and his bike. Okay. Another tip is, this isn't, the lighting wasn't severely harsher. There were a lot of clouds, but just increase the moodiness of the clouds. You can do that with clarity and some other tools in Lightroom, but look how dark the mountain is. It looked much nicer than that with my eyes, but the camera didn't pick up on that. It underexposed because the cliff was backlit. Okay, so bring it into processing, boom, brighten the clouds, they're more colorful, brighten the hillside, the rocks, they're more colorful, just a much more dynamic image. Now you might get into a situation where the sky just blew out. Okay, I didn't take another picture. I didn't correct as I should have. This is Devil's Tower out in Wyoming. And you can see it has that look. There's no detail in the clouds. The sky is overexposed. Okay, bad. But it was what it was. And when I got it back and I said, there's no way to correct that. I can't deal with it. And I'm not going to leave it like that. So boom, sky replacement. Okay. And what I found out was with the new masking tool now in Lightroom, you can't replace the sky. Okay, you used to be able to do that, but you have to take it in. If you want to actually replace the sky, you have to take it into Photoshop now. Here's a biggie. The other way to deal with harsh light is take advantage of it. Use those strong shadows and bright highlights and convert it to black and white. Okay. In a case like this, there's so little color down here that it's not worth keeping, or almost becomes a distraction. Okay. You eliminate with a black and white and you have a cleaner look, to the image. Again, silhouetting like we did before, well, silhouetting and black and white. So the color over here, that's one look. A different interpretation is going to black and white. So processing, in summary, processing can do so much for your images. I think it's an absolutely essential step. And of course, if you're shooting RAW, it certainly is. But even if you're shooting JPEG, the camera has already processed the image according to what settings you have in picture styles. But you can do more in post. I mean, you're limited because it's a JPEG file, but you can still do some processing. So I think it's important. Or you might want to consider, changing your picture styles and then doing your processing more in Lightroom or a program. But if you're going to do that, just shoot RAW. If you're willing and eager to do the processing, don't mess with JPEG files, just shoot RAW. HDR is an effective way to control a high contrast scene. If you're not shooting for the highlights specifically or exclusively, or not shooting for the shadows exclusively, which you can do, the extremes, then if you want detail in both the highlights and the shadows, go with HDR, exposure bracketing. If you're going to remove distractions other than dust spots, No, go into Photoshop. Dodging and burning takes your images to the next level. Converting an image to black and white can really be good. And in some cases, you just need to replace that ugly sky. That's it, guys. That's it. I'm open for questions.
Dennis, that was an excellent.
Dennis, that was just a lot of wonderful information, and considering my memory, I'm looking forward to having it.
I will send a
I'll
link out tomorrow.
download.
You'll be able to download the PowerPoint presentation, so you have all the notes. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. That was
Okay.
excellent.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, Rich, you have a comment or question?
Yeah, Dennis, when you're traveling on a long trip like that, or when you go to the shore or whatever, do you do your processing while you're away? And if so, you do it on a laptop. And if so, what do you use for a laptop? Or do you wait till you get home?
Well, up until this trip out west, well, and one cruise, I always waited till I came home. I just kept my images on multiple memory cards, and I processed them at home. Number one, I didn't like carrying the laptop. And number two, I don't like processing on a laptop so much. But when I went on the cruise, I tried it and I thought, I liked it. Plus, I like to put some images up on Facebook as I travel. So when I went out west, took the laptop, and I have Lightroom and Photoshop on the laptop. So every day when we were done traveling and we found a room at a hotel, first thing I would do would be set up my station with the laptop, upload my pictures from the day onto the computer, well, onto a portable hard drive.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a backup copy, and then I would work from there and process some images, mainly so I could post some on Facebook because I wanted people to follow my travels.
And what do you use for a laptop, Dennis? Excuse me.
Oh, it's an HP laptop.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, what I found when I got home and I started over again, I wasn't happy with the way a lot of the images were processed. Number one, it's just different processing them on the laptop, and it's a different device. Number two, which you have to be very careful of, the ambient lighting conditions affect how you process images. So if you're working at night and there's a desk lamp there and you're looking at your images, the color balance, the color temperature of that light will affect how you process your images. I did wedding pictures like this years ago, and I realized I'd look at them the next day and realize, whoa, the colors all are off. And I realized that the bulb I had was an incandescent bulb. This was a bunch of years ago, an incandescent bulb. So I went to Lowe's and got a daylight balanced bulb. So then, the light was more consistent. So the point was, I wasn't happy with the images that I processed. I was happy enough to get them up on Facebook and people appreciated them that way. But for my own purposes and my website, when I came back, I reprocessed them anyway.
Great. Thank you. Great.
Yeah, you're welcome. If you're interested, anyone, in seeing the lengthy, well, not, I'm divided up into geographical locations, but if you're interested in seeing the actual images from the trip out west, there's the link, and you'll be able to click right on that from the PDF that I send out tomorrow. And there's my contact information. Let's see, Jim, did you have a question or comment?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay, who else? Marlene's unmuted. Marlene, you have a question?
No.
Okay. Anybody else? Question or comment?
I have a comment, Dennis. That was
Okay.
excellent. That was excellent. I really
Well,
enjoyed that.
Thanks, Joe. I've been working on this since I got back in May.
I have a comment.
It has been a project, but it's been very good for me putting the thoughts together. Which has always been the case. When I have to teach a lesson, it helps me a lot to organize my thoughts. Okay, somebody else, come on, put me on the spot.
It was fantastic.
Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah. Thank you, Dennis. I'm glad you did a second session. It was very good. Very helpful.
All right,
Yes,
all right.
thank you.
And if you're thinking, if you're someone who's shooting JPEG and you're worried about doing RAW, well, there is a learning curve with Lightroom. and getting organized, as some of you can attest to that. But once you get things set up, and the processing itself is not difficult at all. And you can set up some presets that take care of it, and it's almost automated. It's more the organizational thing that's you need to get a handle on. But anyway, that's a different story. So only jump to raw files if you're ready to deal with those issues. Anything else?
Yeah, can we have a class on organizing your photos?
Yes, I do that. It's called Lightroom 101. Yes, and I'll be offering.
Can we have a class on finding your photos?
Oh, that's a challenge. Just ask Dick Mesner. We're dealing
What
with that
about a
today.
class on?
Yeah, I am offering the Lightroom class, and well, some people in February, by the way, and some people hesitate to take this first Lightroom class because it's more of organizing and getting ready to use Lightroom. But honestly, it's the key to using Lightroom successfully, because if you're not organized with your files and you don't understand how Lightroom works, things are going to go downhill sooner or later.
Amen.
It can be a challenge.
Dennis,
Yes.
your classes, do you have to have a, like I don't have, I have a desktop. Do you have to drag some kind of computer there?
Oh, well, no. In fact, the Lightroom class is going to be held on Zoom, which is, I'm going to be demonstrating. It's not really going to be a hands-on workshop thing where you would be there with a laptop. That's really, Joe and I tried that a couple of years ago, and it's very difficult to manage. So this will be watch what I do, and it works well. I've done it quite a lot of times on Zoom. It works well in that format.
And which Lightroom are you doing, the Lightroom Classic or?
Yeah, Lightroom Classic. Yep. Okay, anything else? Okay, guys, that's been fun. Thanks for joining me. I want to wish what, Joe?
A round of applause for Dennis, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dennis.
guys. Thanks. That's very nice of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to wish
you.
everybody a happy holidays, and for those of you who celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas to
Thank
you.
you.
Christmas. Merry
Thanks.
Christmas. Okay. See you next year.
That's right. See you next year. Wow.
And a happy new year.
You too. Let's see.